Hello and welcome to this IFG event on how to build on the success of the vaccine rollout. In this budget week, or budget month as it should perhaps now be called, we're going to give you a break from taxes and rabbits and dive into the big unknown variable that could yet throw Rishi Sunak's and everyone else's plans off track. My name's Tom Sasse. I'm an Associate Director at the IFG and lead our work on policymaking, including looking at aspects of the government's coronavirus response. So with around a third of the population vaccinated, we're going to discuss everything from the NHS's rollout and how to boost vaccine uptake, to how the government is managing the threat of variants and questions about manufacturing and global distribution. We have a really top panel to do it. George Freeman has been a Conservative MP since 2010 and held ministerial posts in the transport, business and health departments. He's very active in policy discussions, was a chair of the PM's policy board and recently set up the International Health Resilience Commission. He's long been banging the drum for the life sciences sector. He was the UK's first life sciences minister, and before entering politics, he had a career in biomedical startups. Bex Fisher is a GP in Oxford and a senior policy fellow at the Health Foundation. On a Monday or Tuesday, you'd find her in the surgery getting people vaccinated, but luckily for us, she spends the rest of her week engaging with the policy questions the NHS faces. And along with colleagues at the Health Foundation, she's been paying particular attention to inequalities in vaccine access and uptake. Tom Chivers is an author and science editor at Unherd. Tom's been doing a huge public service throughout the pandemic, explaining the science behind the virus, testing, vaccine development and deployment, and much else besides. He has a new book out on how to read numbers, written with David Chivers, who I can only presume is a family relation. And finally, Professor Robin Shattock. Robin is chair of Mucosal Infection and Immunity and COVID-19 vaccine lead at Imperial College London. He and his team have been working on an mRNA vaccine, that's the technology used in the Pfizer, BioNTech and Moderna vaccines, and are currently focused on helping other vaccines to adapt to variants. So before we get started, you can submit your questions using the bar at the bottom of the screen. If you include your name and where you're writing from, try and make them short and ensure they are questions. If you see someone else asking a question you like the sound of, just upvote it. We will be tweeting from @IFG events using the hashtag IFG vaccine. And we will have a video and sound recording of the event on the website tomorrow. And I'd like to thank the forum at Imperial College London for kindly supporting this event, and we have more events coming up with them, which I'll tell you about at the end. So Bex, I wanted to start with you. We've heard lots about the success of the UK's approach to securing vaccines, led by Kate Bingham, and about supply being the only rate constraining factor. But successful deployment was not a given. So I wanted to ask for your view from the inside on what the successes have been and how the NHS has handled the rollout.
Thanks, Tom. I'm so grateful that that is your first question, that, a couple of months into 2021, that's the question, not why has this gone so horribly wrong. And of course, procurement and supply are the two things outside of the scope of your question, but so fundamental to it. I guess the bits that I see more closely in general practice and where I would attribute success is probably in three broad domains. One is getting the policy right and the strategy right. One is people and one is primary care. And by policy, I mean, it's easy to use the retrospectoscope to say, well, this was always going to go wrong. But lots of people had to make very big decisions. Should hospitals be doing vaccines? Should it be general practice, primary care networks? What level does this best? And when we get those decisions right, we often don't scrutinise them, and when they go wrong, we unpick them at length. So there's something about getting the strategy right. I think something that is easy to take for granted, but this should shine a light on, is the strength of list-based primary care in this country. So 60 million people in England are registered with general practice, and we have great electronic healthcare records, relatively speaking. That's a really important basis to be able to roll out a programme like this from. And it means you can add nuance. So the government don't know who has epilepsy and who has long-term health conditions, but GPs do. And populations often trust their GPs and the staff who work with us in primary care. So I think that's a really strong foundation. And just finally to say people are so important to this. People who are leading the programmes, Emily Lawson, the relationship that Nikki Kanani, the Director of Primary Care at NHS England, has established with GPs over the last couple of years, I think has been crucial to taking people with them on what is quite a big ask. But then just discretionary effort from people who have been working in pretty difficult circumstances for a long time, and certainly over the past year, now putting, really going the extra mile. And that's not just GPs, that's the whole team involved in vaccine rollout, including all of the volunteers and folk who have come out of retirement to help us out.
And can the NHS keep going at this pace?
It's a hard question. I think we've had a really tough winter in general practice, and I kind of feel like despite the huge amount of additional work that the vaccine programme has put on us, it's also been a real enabler because it has been so hopeful, and it has been a really lovely thing that we have been able to do for and with our communities. And so strangely, although it's more work, I think it has in some ways contributed to resilience. I don't want to go too kind of apple pie about it all. There are challenges, and I think something that we've struggled to do, but are trying to do, is look at the workforce implications of this kind of on a longer term basis, and particularly we'll get on to talking, I'm sure, about how often we may have to vaccinate people and what it would look like to embed this programme into the NHS long term. And there are definitely resource implications. I think now a lot of us are driven by the motivation, as the public are, that this is a way out of the predicament we find ourselves in.
Yeah. And just before I turn to George, you mentioned the different groups involved there. I mean, do you think this has longer term lessons for the NHS about integration of different organisations?
Yes, I think for me, in my experience of working in the NHS and in policy for quite a while now, integration has been a word that is bandied around a lot, but is somewhat difficult to see sometimes in practice. And actually, this has been probably the best exemplar I've ever seen of groups working together. And by groups, I don't just mean general practice working with CCGs, with acute trusts. I mean the NHS working with the army on logistics. I mean GPs working really closely with their communities, with faith leaders, with inclusion health groups to understand how we improve vaccine confidence, how we reach underserved populations. And I think that's really encouraging. And I think that one of the things I would love to see happen is people to look at this as an example of how integration can work and try and learn from it.
Brilliant. Well, we'll come back to that. So, George, we indicated there that the sort of foundation of this rollout has been reasonably stable supply. What do you think the government and industry have got right there, and how confident are you looking ahead?
Thank you, and thanks for having me at this event. And I just echo exactly what Rebecca just said. I think this has illustrated over the last year the best and also the most challenging in our health system. And I think there's some really big lessons to learn. I mean, just on the supply side, I think it's worth saying, if you'd said to any of us, I think a year ago, within a year we will be here, we will have developed a vaccine, developed a supply of multiple vaccines here in the UK, and we'll be halfway through vaccinating the entire population, I wouldn't have believed you. I mean, it's been the most extraordinary success and a tribute to UK science and UK medicine. I think there are lots of lessons about the supply side and the vaccine task force. I mean, really, I think you'd expect me to say this. I think it speaks to the importance of long-term strategy. A lot of this work on being able to sequence the genome goes back to the investment in genomics capacity in the UK back in the coalition. The MHRA reforms have paid dividends. The accelerated access procurement system that we put in place has come good. The MERS work, the UK vaccine network that we set up back in 2016, there's a lot of long-term legacy that has come good for the UK through this. In addition, I think, to some really first-class leadership through the vaccine task force and some really important lessons about procurement, working at pace, cutting deals, backing multiple suppliers, so there's some really important lessons. I think longer term going forward, clinical trials as a huge piece of work, which I'm working with Number 10 on, how we make sure we learn the lessons from clinical trials and continue to improve the UK clinical trial network. I think the data has been an area of real weakness, actually. The research data good, but we've still relied on paper and cardboard in terms of public messaging for much of this. But the really big challenges and opportunities, I think, are going forward. This has been a wake-up call that biosecurity has got to be right at the heart of UK industrial strategy and science, and health economics. I think we've learned that for decades we've neglected real health economics, and the good news is that the Treasury and business, I think, have really discovered the value of health and the cost of disease, which is what our Health Resilience Commission is looking at. Could we build some much more tangible metrics in to create the incentives for real population health prevention, disease prevention and health promotion? I think if we can make that the legacy, then we'll look back and say that this was a crisis which triggered some really long-term and long overdue systemic improvements.
That's brilliant. And I mean, you mentioned that it's sort of difficult for governments to sometimes learn the lessons of these crises because, you know, a few years later, politicians find other priorities. So what do you think is the sort of mechanism for ensuring that politicians are still focused on those biosecurity threats that you mentioned in a couple of years' time?
Well, mechanisms for shaping government policy, there's a thesis. I mean, I think this year the G7 is a huge opportunity, and I think rightly the government are focusing on making the G7 itself and the health summit a serious moment for international commitment to both better global cooperation on research and vaccine rollout. The commission that I've set up with John Bell and others is trying to make the argument that, as well as that really important work, advanced economies have got to take the lesson from this, that the old assumption that once you're through the cholera curve in development, you don't have to worry about infectious disease. I think that's been exposed, profoundly exposed, and in a global economy, we're all now as vulnerable to infectious disease as the weakest link in the chain. So a major commitment to global health security. And I think, you know, biosecurity in the broader sense, plant, animal and human health. I think we've got some real opportunities here to take a big lead in that integrated genomics science behind global biosecurity across those sectors. And I think if we get it right, and this event is part of that, this year we could really move the life science industry to accelerate the work that's going on population health and making the industry more focused on helping us prevent disease and better detect, diagnose and treat earlier, rather than this expensive paradigm of late stage diagnosis and very over hospitalized, over medicalized treatment.
Mm-hmm. And just finally, what do you make of the timing of this as a sort of moment to sort of reorganize some of our healthcare institutions? We've got noises about the creation of a new National Institute of Health Protection. What's your view there?
Well, I was one of those people who, I think I was in the first meeting with Andrew Lansley back in 2010 when a group of MPs, I'd asked the question, you know, given that there's going to be no reorganisation of the NHS, what's the coalition's commitment to improving healthcare and standards? And we walked out of the meeting having been just told about a massive reorganisation of the NHS. My own view is, to Rebecca's point, in my constituency in Norfolk, we've seen the most extraordinary coming together. Social care, social services, the county council, Public Health England, the NHS, the police, the army, huge coming together, and things that were impossible for the last decade have just become possible. Money has been able to be transferred. To me, this has been a moment where we really need to commit to proper localization and integration of health and social care. And certainly from a rural perspective in my part of the world, I would be arguing for a full integration at county level. If Norfolk social care and NHS and public health was all done together, I think we could make this a really catalytic moment for population health prevention and for tackling that sort of traditional, almost apartheid really, between the high hospitalized, medicalized health and the rather neglected social care in a county like Norfolk. The two are very different worlds. They came together this year hugely successfully, and I think it would be a shame to let that go.
That's a really important point. Tom, I wanted to come to you. So the big threat now that everyone's talking about, that you've been writing about, is from variants which could potentially make sort of vaccines less effective. We still, I think, have a missing Brazilian variant on the loose, although they must be getting close to tracking that one down now. Broadly, the government set out its approach to lockdown lifting, hotel quarantine and so on. How confident are you in the UK government's approach to managing this risk?
Well, I wouldn't want to say necessarily about the government's approach, but I'd certainly say that the UK is extraordinarily well set up to be ready for this sort of thing in certain respects. I mean, we talk a lot about the UK being world leading in X or Y, but it is absolutely true that the UK is world leading in genetic sequencing. And I seem to remember we've done it. I can't remember if it's 40% of the world's total sequencing, or slightly more than half of the world's. So it is nearly true to say that we've done more sequencing, genetic sequencing of the virus than the rest of the world combined. And that, for instance, is what allowed us to detect the Kent variant so quickly. That and some good luck with how the PCR tests worked, because it happened to. One of the things the PCR test tested for, the standard ones in the UK, happened to be one of the mutations, so it made it very easy to track it. So that means we are really, really well set up to monitor the arrival of new variants and to sort of detect them where they are. I think it's something like 1 in 10 of all PCR to people who test positive on PCR then go on to sequence it, go on to have the virus's sequenced. So that means that we have this really, really good picture of what the variants and mutations are in this country, which is an order of magnitude stronger than almost any other country in the world, apart from possibly Denmark, I think. So in that respect, we are really, really well set up. There's other reasons to be positive, which I think Professor Shattock can probably tell you about in more detail, but the mRNA vaccines in particular, which like the Pfizer one, the Moderna one, the Imperial one that is still under development, I think, they are very, very. They're extremely plug and play is the phrase that was used to me a few times. Which so you can. If a new variant pops up, it's very straightforward to repurpose the mRNA vaccine to the new variants as they arrive. And while some of the other ones, like the Oxford vaccine, which is a viral vector, is slightly harder, they have been aware since as soon as these new variants were detected that they should get these new processes underway. And so it'll be very rapid. These new vaccines will be available. Obviously, that's only so reassuring on its own because the Moderna vaccine was apparently ready 2 days after the virus was first sequenced back in January last year, and then it took a year of safety of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3 trials and so on before it was allowed to be issued an emergency use license. But I think it is fair to say that the regulatory systems are in place to, if you're only making minor modifications to a vaccine, that you can just trot it out fairly straightforwardly with just safety trials. Certainly, that's what we do with flu each year. It's not as if we have to do decades-long vaccine trials on each year's new vaccine, flu vaccines. So I think from all those points of view, I'm not desperately worried about new variants in the long term. I think we can easily get these things through, and we've already shown that we can get the vaccine to large numbers of people really quickly for all the reasons that Dr. Fisher was talking about earlier on. Centralized NHS database, annual vaccinations could be possibly done. The question is whether we'll be good at spotting them at the border as they come in, and I think there are real concerns about our quarantining and so on and testing at the border, but hopefully that will get better. I think the rise of lateral flow tests is broadly a positive thing on that front, with certain caveats about worries about false negatives and so on.
Brilliant. That's really interesting. And Robin will take us a bit more into the sort of speed with which we can get sort of updated vaccines to deployment in a moment. I just wanted to ask about, so in the government sort of lockdown exit strategy, it's got these 4 tests. And some scientists are sort of saying, well, this looks like it could leave it open whether they allow quite a large outbreak in the unvaccinated population still, because you don't have sort of absolute number of cases as only one of those. What do you think about that? Do you think we can afford to have, you know, the virus sort of spreading a bit as we release lockdown, and that's not too much of a risk on the variant front?
Well, I think it's always going to be a trade-off, isn't it? And I think I can't remember exactly which tier aligned to which, but I was speaking to one scientist who was sort of saying that what you have these tiers when you get the vaccine, the virus down to an acceptable level, you then open up to the point when R hangs around about 1, and you can sort of allow it to burble away in the background without being too deadly. And I think that if the data versus dates thing, as long as we take that seriously, I think that seems quite a reasonable way of going about things. When the virus gets down to a certain low level, especially with the growing protection of the vaccine, I think it is reasonable to say there is a level of risk, a level of virus in the population which we are comfortable with, and we think that the value of having schools open and having shops open and these things which genuinely are important to people's lives, we are willing to make that trade-off. We think these are worth the value. I mean, the question, like I say, is whether the data versus dates thing will be stuck to. And the other thing is that's really important with the opening up, the roadmap, whatever you want to call it, is that there are these sort of good chunks of time, 4 or 5 weeks really, between each of the phases, so that in theory, middle school science lessons when you were a kid, they teach you to change one variable at a time and observe the changes. To some degree, that's what they're trying to do. It's not as straightforward as that, and of course the main change will be, for example, on March the 8th, opening schools. There won't be any really big changes until middle of April after that, and so hopefully we'll be able to get much better sense of the impact of things like school openings on R and so on. So I think I'm comfortable with the idea of opening up somewhat and keeping, as long as we've got virus at a low acceptable level, and then carefully observing whether the things we changed can be maintained while keeping the virus at that low level. I think that's important. The one thing that really bothered me was this idea that they are irreversible, whether it's just something nice to say, but obviously if we open schools and then the virus blasts around everywhere again, then I would suggest you reverse it pretty damn quick. But that may be something that you can't reasonably say as a politician. I don't know. Yeah,
no, that's really interesting, and I think that sort of being able to change path quickly is one of the things that we've criticised the government for not necessarily being that well to do. Just quickly on border quarantine and the sort of hotel quarantine, then, is your view that with sort of ramping up of testing at the border and sort of using these tests, even with the sort of only having 30 countries on the red list with the longer self-isolation period, that would be okay, or do you think you'd probably need to expand that list?
Okay, so with the very large caveat that I am just some guy, right? I speak to clever people and write down what they say is mainly my thing. My own feeling throughout this pandemic has been that we have sailed a bit close to the wind on too many occasions. We sort of don't do many things like, we haven't got evidence that this will be bad, so we'll assume it won't be bad, or we've got no evidence that this will work, so we'll assume it won't work. Things like masks, And I made that mistake early on in the pandemic with saying, there's no evidence that border closures will work, even though common sense sort of suggests that they would. There's, there is no good evidence. There's no RCTs or whatever. I don't know. And I think that my own feeling is that with border closures and hotel quarantining and red lists, this is one of those things where it seems pretty likely, or certainly plausible, that they will be helpful. The costs, it strikes me as that the costs are probably going to be quite low, since there's not going to be a great deal of international tourism for the next while, and people coming for business might be more willing to do the quarantining things. So my own instinct would be that even if there's no good evidence that we need it further around the world, I think my own instinct would be that the cost of imposing wider restrictions and more hotel quarantining would probably be quite low, and the benefits potentially could be large. So it seems like a good bet.
Brilliant. Robin, tell us about the vaccine you've been working on. Incredibly exciting sort of technology that has all these opportunities opening up ahead. And then just give us a bit of a view on how confident do you feel on this question of how vaccines can stay ahead of variants?
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for inviting me. So the vaccine that we're working on, we're still progressing in early clinical trials. We're waiting for our pivotal data to come through. Obviously, when we started our approach this time last year, it wasn't clear whether any vaccines would work. And now we're in a very happy position that there is a large number of candidates coming through. So we're not sure what place our vaccine will have in that portfolio, which is now pretty crowded. The good news is that obviously these vaccines can be made very quickly. And we've talked about variants and the UK's ability to pick up on those variants very efficiently through the sequencing. And I think one of the things that's already to some extent reassuring is, although we're talking about variants, we're talking about a few key mutations that are cropping up in different parts of the world. So one of particular concern is at a position 484 in the spike glycoprotein, and that's occurring in South Africa, in Brazil. We're also seeing it popping up in some strains that derived in the UK, in the US. So what we're seeing is a degree of converging evolution. The virus is coming to the same solution for higher rates of transmission. And that's a very different problem to something like HIV, where actually we see a huge diversity going off in multiple directions. And so the number of variants that we need to be prepared for is quite controllable and quite achievable with vaccine technology. And we already know in terms of those vaccines that have been approved, some of them work better against some of those variants than others. And so if we see any variants starting to predominate, we can roll out vaccines that are better against that particular variant. But going forward, clearly all the companies are working on versions of their vaccines that can act against those variants. And as you rightly said, if you've already proved that your vaccine works in clinical trials in terms of efficacy, changing just a very small part of the vaccine means that you only have to do safety studies before it's reintroduced as an acceptable vaccine. The RNA platforms work really well for that because it's a synthetic process. It can be done very readily and very quickly. The other technology is a bit slower, but can certainly work. And I know colleagues at Oxford are working on a variant that has the 484 mutation in there, so that's likely to become available. But longer term, I think we also need to be very aware that we potentially are missing an opportunity in the UK. We talked about legacy and investment in sequencing, and that's been a fantastic success. But what we really haven't been as astute at is investing in RNA technology, which has really proved its worth recently. And when I sit here and look at the investment in Germany of hundreds of millions from the German government and in the region of billions in the US government, it's very clear that we've got a long way to catch up. And of course, those companies that have benefited from being first into the vaccine field will also now get massive returns on that investment. And I think actually if the UK can have a joined up strategy that builds on the ability to sequence things very fast with the ability to manufacture in UK with this new emerging technology, then we'd be able to catch up and potentially be very prepared for any future pandemic as well.
I wanted to bring George in on that, but just quickly, Robin, on this question of speed, we had Tony Blair at an IFG event last week arguing that we should aim for 100 days from sequencing a genome to deploying a vaccine. Is that realistic?
It's definitely possible. I mean, you know, when we designed our vaccine, our RNA vaccine, we produced a prototype in 14 days. And if you've got the manufacturing facility, you can do that in a matter of weeks. But it's having that facility on standby with the capacity ready to go and fill hundreds of vials, which ultimately becomes the bottleneck rather than the design process.
Yeah, brilliant. George, Robin's taken us in some fascinating questions there, the sort of nimbleness of regulation, but also the financial backing. Do you want to reflect on that?
Yes, thank you. I completely agree with the point Robin made. Two key points, really. So firstly, on the vaccine and the manufacturing side, I mean, it's worth remembering When John Bell and I and Sally Davis and co put vaccines at the heart of the life science strategy back in 2015-16, it was very much the poor relation. You know, in the traditional life science sector, drug discovery had tended to be the sort of the golden sector, and vaccines have been neglected here in the UK. And our point at the time actually was that the manufacturing of vaccines was about to go through a technological revolution, and that was an opportunity for the UK, which indeed it has been shown to be. So I completely agree, Robin, and in the work I'm doing for the PM now on regulation for innovation, one of the things I'm looking at is how we could take the best lessons from this last year and develop a more strategic approach to UK leadership in setting the new regulatory standards for some of this very fast-paced new genomic medicine. And on the funding side, again, similarly, I mean, when I was investing in the sector, very, very few companies in the UK, I mean, vaccines were very much the poor relation. And I think one of the opportunities now is to mobilize both institutional pension assets, I mean, trillions of pounds sitting, very low levels of investment in equity and in research in the UK. And also, I think there's a public appetite now. I mean, I think if you were to launch a UK vaccines ISA right now, you'd find an awful lot of people wanting to back it. So I think there's an opportunity for us to both build a more integrated ecosystem that reflects where this new supply and demand landscape is heading, but also to bring some more retail investment in and bring some more volumes of capital to play, because I think there's a unique moment where the public have realized the value of all this to them and to their communities as well as to the country.
Yeah. Bex, I wanted to come back to you on the issue of equity of access and uptake. The Health Foundation had a great piece on this earlier this week, and clearly the threat of the virus and of mutation is going to be greater if large parts of the population remain unvaccinated. How much data do we actually have on uptake in different groups, and what do you make of efforts so far to sort of boost vaccine confidence, tackle misinformation, and so on?
Thanks, Tom. I think it's such an important question, and I guess it's so important to set this in the overall context of COVID and of what we know about who normally gets left behind, because this is structural. This isn't chance who gets left behind. This relates to long-standing structural problems. So if you look across IMD quintiles, poorer people are about twice as likely to die of COVID as the people who live in our wealthiest areas. If you're a Black Briton, death rates from COVID are about 4 times those of a white Briton. Yet what we're seeing in vaccine rollout is unfortunately predictable, but predominantly poorer people are being left behind and white people are getting the vaccine, and Black Britons are the least likely to have had the vaccine so far. And so these are real challenges. They relate to long-term structural problems that we've had, but I think we have to work out, well, what do we do about them now? And there has been an assumption in the vaccine rollout that these inequalities will exist. So that's good. So we knew they would be there, so we've been looking for them. And there has been quite an impressive effort, I think, to get data at a really quite granular level to understand which populations aren't getting the vaccine. And I guess I would separate it into 2 things. There's one question of vaccine supply. So is the problem here that actually we're not getting vaccine supply to the areas with the populations that need it? Something that frustrated me early on was the initial JCVI prioritisation, which said, well, we're going to prioritise over 80s as a kind of blanket. And the challenge I had with that is actually being over 80 is a privilege that is generally associated with being wealthy and predominantly white. And so if you base your vaccine supply in that way, you are automatically going to leave behind poorer people and you're going to leave behind minoritized ethnic people. But even when we look at vaccine supply and we kind of take that out of the equation and we say, well, what's happening in our communities on a really granular level, what we now understand is that even within a layer super output area, so a very small geographic area of a couple of postcodes, if you are a wealthier person living in that area, you are more likely to have had the vaccine. If you are a white person living in that area, you are more likely to have had the vaccine. And I think that takes us into these questions about how do we get vaccine confidence and how do we reach underserved populations. So this isn't just about data and supply, it's about access and confidence. Last week, NHS England made about £4.2 million available to CCGs to try and start to address these issues. One thing I would just like to say that I think it was thrown up by the JCVI's phase 2 prioritisation last week, where they made a decision to continue prioritising by age groups, which is controversial for a number of reasons. There will be people who say, teachers and the police, and there are all sorts of reasons why that is a controversial decision. But I think one, as relates to equity, is that their prioritisation is based on the idea that we want to get this out quickly. We all understand why that's important. But actually, the underserved populations, the least vaccine confident populations, are the slowest to reach. And if we just say we're going to go with pace, we're going to leave people behind. And the people we leave behind aren't being left behind by chance. They're being left because they are poor or they are minoritized ethnic. And I think we have to really look long and hard and say, OK, how do we challenge this? How do we make sure we're not leaving people behind? And how do we get depth of penetration through our vaccine cohorts, not just pace rollout?
It's such an important point, and I just wondered how much would you place the emphasis there on the JCVI ranking? Because of course the JCVI did also say there needs to be some flexibility locally in how different areas move down through these groups. And how much would you place it on sort of the way in which supply has actually been distributed? Have you been held back by not being given enough vaccine to move on to those groups?
So I think the answer to that depends on how much there is a supply constraint. So I work in an area of very high deprivation. And at the start, we were really being constrained because we had an exceptionally small cohort 1. Not many people where I work get to live to be over 80. So it took us a day to vaccinate cohort 1. But we weren't allowed to move down through the cohorts, and we wanted to get to cohort 4. So cohort 4 is where you bring in the clinically extremely vulnerable. And we have a huge number of patients in cohort 4 because we have very many people who live with multiple health conditions, often from a very young age. And so we had a situation where we weren't being given vaccine supply because we didn't have many over 80s, but we had this absolutely massive group of people who are extremely vulnerable. And our group of people who are extremely vulnerable often live in big multi-generational households where people are working outside the home. And so I would argue they're actually at much higher risk of death from COVID because they can't effectively isolate themselves. And so I think that's less the case now because supply is less of an issue. So if we are allowed to move through cohorts, which is eventually what happened, that's one way of challenging this. But I think we also just have to be mindful that there are some levers here. So you are paid by the number of vaccines you do. And so that is an incentive to get vaccines done quickly. It's not necessarily an incentive to go and reach your underserved populations. Lots of people are doing that because I think it's the right thing to do. But we all know that incentives and levers matter. And I think we need to think about where they've been placed at the moment. And is that the right place to encourage the type of behaviour that we want?
Mm. We've got a question here from Anonymous who asks, any thoughts on the likelihood of vaccine passports of some kind or another? Tom, I wonder if I could come to you first on that.
I mean, yeah, it seemed pretty likely to me. Again, like not that I have any huge special insight, but certainly it seems the most thing. And it's not as if, I suppose it depends what we mean by vaccine passports, right? Were they vaccine passports in the sense of, will you be allowed to travel to Greece or Spain without getting vaccinated? I mean, I suspect there'll be something like that for overseas travel fairly soon, because I mean, it's not as if it's unusual if you want to go to I don't know, South Africa to get various jabs now, and they need to be put in your passport to show that you've had them, yellow fever or malaria or whatever, and sort of not malaria, but yeah. So I don't think that in itself is. I think it's probably going to happen, and probably going to happen quite soon, especially if some governments, say in say Spain or Greece, then you'll find that there'll be quite a lot of demand among British people for it because they want to go on holiday. So I think that will happen fairly soon, would be my guess. Whether there'll be passports in a not quite so precise sense of sort of you get a vaccine and now you're allowed to go to the football or something like that, opening up society for people with a vaccine, I'd be a little bit more surprised because it seems logistically difficult to do. But there's sort of the mechanisms in place for it. But again, no, it may be that it's useful. The thing is with that, my own feeling is that by the time you've got the mechanism sorted out, there'd be such a huge proportion of the population would already be vaccinated that it would become it'll almost be something of a waste of time. And then there's the thing that with the new variants coming around, will we have to do that again? We're not going to have every year needing a new thing so you can go and watch Liverpool or whatever, or go and go to the pub. I think that might, again, purely on my instinct without any gigantic special insight into it, that seems the most likely situation. But it wouldn't surprise me at all to see that there are vaccine passports and possibly even annual boosters required every year to go on holiday to various different countries and things like that.
George, where do you think the Conservative Party is on this? Michael Gove has been tasked with leading a review, which is looking at the sort of different ethical, implementation questions and so on. Where do you think? What's your sense of where they're at?
So I don't detect any great sort of Conservative backbench movement about vaccine passports. I can see why you're asking, but I think the sort of lockdown skeptic libertarian wing is pretty small, and it's very, very much smaller than it was in the autumn, when I think most people, I certainly looked on with amusement. I think most people in the country could see that getting the disease under control meant some very difficult decisions, and lockdowns work. I think there'll be strong support for a sensible policy based on decent science and clear thinking. And my own view is I'm like Tom. I think most people sort of accept that it's got to be proportionate, but that in the same way that when you travel to some countries you have to have a yellow fever certificate, you have to have certificates, surgeons have to be certified before they operate. It's got to be proportionate. I think people would think it was very strange if you had to have a vaccine certificate to walk up your high street. But I think they would probably agree that if some point later in the year you wanted to go to a nightclub, that's different. And I think people are quite sensible, and I think they have, on the whole, they've seen that, we all have to make some sacrifices for the good of both public and individual health. So I don't detect any great political pushback. I'm sure a few people will try, but I think the public opinion is pretty firmly on whatever helps allow us to get back to safe living.
And do you think a use case like a nightclub is realistic, given a vaccination isn't 100% guarantee? You don't quite know what someone's status is.
No, it's probably a terrible example, but I was really just making to illustrate the point. I'm trying to think of will you need a vaccine certificate to go to the pub is probably the sort of the pub test, right? And I think people would say, well, in some ways, remember, of course, having a vaccination we don't know for sure that it necessarily means you can't spread the disease. In a way, having had a test, is the bigger test. And I think people were very happy in the summer to give information about whether they've had a test. I think as long as we make testing really easy and vaccinations really easy and the rules sensible and fair, I think the public are with us on this.
Yeah. Bex, I was interested to get your response on that and some of the sort of ethical questions involved in vaccine passports. I also wanted to throw you another question from Andy Wertheim from Oxford, who says, if large-scale annual booster jabs become necessary, will new deployment methods be needed to relieve the pressure on our GPs and allow them to get back to their day jobs?
Thanks, Tom. Perhaps if I take the second one first, if that's okay. Yes, Andy, I think they probably will be. The thing I would challenge slightly is that GPs are doing the day job at the moment. So we are doing multiple jobs. So, for example, in the practice I work in, we are actually the vaccine site for our primary. So vaccines are being delivered by primary care networks. So groups of a small number of general practices, usually 4 or 5 or 6. And so general practice at the moment is operating as normal. And so we are effectively double running. And there are significant staffing implications of that. At the moment, I think we're meeting this via mostly discretionary effort, to be honest. People working on days when they would otherwise be working in other ways, people volunteering, people coming back out of retirement. And so, yes, clearly that isn't going to be a long-term prospect. But I think there are other options and things may evolve. So at the moment, the logistics of running vaccine clinics, particularly for Pfizer, which is just slightly more complicated in terms of the cold chain logistics, but also how you draw it up. It takes longer to give somebody a vaccine than it does just to give them a flu jab, where it comes in a pre-filled syringe and there is much less of a lengthy consent process for it. So I think there are ways that in time we may be able to streamline this and make it less of a sort of time-consuming thing to do. But in principle, yes, we are going to have to work out how we do this alongside general practice in the future. And I think general practice logically is probably the right place to be delivering this now and going forwards. To that question of vaccine passports, I mean, it's so difficult, isn't it? I think we have to say, well, what are we trying to achieve with vaccine passports? And I think there are different answers to that depending on where we are talking about applying them. So are we talking about vaccine passports for international travel? To me, that is a different thing to, are we talking about a vaccine passport to go to Glastonbury or to the pub? I think we also have to be very wary of using them as an incentive to get a jab. That said, I am mindful that a very big incentive to get a jab is not wanting to get sick from or die of COVID. And your risk of doing that decreases as we go down the age cohorts. Your risk of being exposed to vaccine misinformation also increases as we go down age cohorts. So my understanding is that Facebook is currently the biggest source of vaccine misinformation. And interestingly, exposure to vaccine misinformation is a kind of trickle-up effect from our youngest age groups of the population to older adults. Clearly, that's not always the case, but it is an important thing to consider. So something I'm interested to see is, are we going to maintain levels of uptake in younger populations who potentially have less to benefit from? The caveat I would throw in there is that long COVID is not to be underestimated in terms of the morbidity it is causing. I think that is a powerful incentive for younger people to get vaccinated. But one final point, a lot of people who are underserved by the health system and by this vaccine rollout are people who will not be able to benefit from some of the privilege we've just talked about. They're not people who would be planning to get on a plane and go to a foreign holiday, and they're not people who are going to have available income to spend in a pub or by going to Glastonbury. So I just think if we're thinking about vaccine passports as a lever to increase vaccine uptake, we also have to be aware that actually it's not going to be an effective lever in some of our most underserved, underconfident populations.
Robin, I wonder if I could bring you in at that point. So we've opened up this question of, the slightly longer term vision of boosters. There's been talk of all-in-one vaccines or, sort of updating boosters. Can you talk us through a little bit like what that would look like and some of the sort of, deployment questions involved in that? And then I also wanted to just throw you another question, which is around the sort of global supply issues. So there's been quite a lot of criticism of rich countries for sort of not doing enough there. Do you think that that's fair?
So let me start with the supply and the booster question first, because I think one thing that we need to acknowledge is one of the reasons that this virus is causing such a problem at the moment is it's ramping its way through a population that has no immunity whatsoever. So it's very different to influenza, where you may get a new strain, but you've already seen a type of influenza before. And I suspect, and I think it's widely held in scientific circles, that actually the cellular immune response that you get to either infection or the vaccine is still likely to give you protection from serious disease or death, even though you may feel unwell. and that will probably be around for quite some time and is not being eroded by these current mutations. So vaccines will get better. We talked about the Pfizer vaccine needing a cold chain. I suspect that will be fixed fairly shortly. So I'm sure we'll soon see, the equivalent of influenza vaccines where the COVID vaccine comes in a pre-filled syringe or a similar technology. And it may be, in the first year we see most people get a booster, but I suspect that the way things will pan out is that we will look to boost the vulnerable, where their immune responses may be less robust. And we'll probably see increasing complacency in younger cohorts that may not see there's a benefit from constantly getting boosting immunizations. And it's clear that with influenza, there are still people who would benefit from an annual influenza vaccine who are no longer coming forward. And so I think we'll see the problem will change over time. I don't think it's a given that we will be boosting the entire population every year for multiple years to come. So it will change. You asked me about global supply, and that is important. And we were talking about things like quarantining coming into the UK. It's clear that that's not sustainable for the long term. And the only way we're going to be able to stop doing that is if we manage to control this virus on a global basis. And so we really need to be ensuring that vaccines are made globally available. The UK has been a leader in that space. I mean, the UK has given, I think now, over $500 million to COVAX, the initiative to make vaccines available globally. It's either the biggest donation or one of the biggest donations. So we've set a very good precedent there. Occasionally, the UK is criticised a little bit because it is true we have made advanced purchases for everybody in the UK to get about 4 different types of vaccines. But again, I think we need to recognise that some of those vaccines that have been purchased have not actually passed the testing phase and have not been approved. And so whether those actually make it, we don't know. We're not sitting here with a stockpile of vaccines sitting in a warehouse that are ready to go somewhere else and that are spare. We may get to that stage, and I think if we do, then it would be equitable and right to be shipping them elsewhere.
Brilliant. And question from Jill here for you, Robin. Will the COVID success spur the development of vaccines for other tropical diseases in future? And does the approach to procurement through sort of advanced purchase commitments suggest that making that happen will become a bit easier?
I mean, I hope it will change things a lot. I think the technology hopefully will change things a lot. There are already advanced purchase agreements for vaccines that have already been licensed, and that's drives down the cost for many low-income countries. But some of the issues that we face in terms of unmet vaccine needs are often where they're infectious diseases that are in low-income countries, so there isn't a strong economic argument for large pharmaceutical companies to go after them, or they're very difficult to solve issues like TB, HIV, malaria, where we don't have effective vaccines. And by driving down the economics of development, and this is again where the RNA technology could change that equation, means that it's viable to start making vaccines for geographically restricted diseases that may not have high income profits. And it also drives down the cost of doing research for some of those really hard to go after targets. So I do think there's a potential for a revolution in this space, but it will need some clear thinking and a long-term strategy in order to make sure that that's realized. Remembering that the RNA technology actually came out of the cancer space. The companies were working on personalized medicine where they could maximize profits. And making vaccines available for low-income countries, they need to cost less than $1 a shot. And that's still a significant challenge for the technology.
Mm. George, I wanted to bring you in on these international questions. I mean, how do you see this sort of question of national versus global priorities? Are we being sort of generous enough? Should we be more generous? Are we doing enough on the international stage?
Look, I think this is an opportunity where the UK can show that, you know, we may not be a military superpower anymore, but we are a science superpower actually, and the soft power impact of what we've done here, I think, is phenomenal. And as a former trade envoy, as well as a citizen of the world, it's, you know, this counts. The world looks at the UK, and I think our investment in COVAX and our commitment to make available our vaccines for less developed countries and is really important. And I'm one of those Conservative MPs urging the Prime Minister to make sure that, you know, in rebalancing the public finances, our international investment and commitment to international development and to the science of international development is not undermined. And in my areas of food, medicine, energy, we've got huge opportunities to help the world go through the next 30 years of sort of green industrial revolution with clean tech, agri-tech, med tech, digital health. And that's not just sort of aid, it's helping the global development in a sustainable way, and it's in everybody's interests. So, and I think the Prime Minister's pretty strong on that actually, and I think you'll see more of that over the coming years. I think in some ways the International Health Resilience Commission that I've set up in the last year, we'll be putting out our interim report in June on the eve of the G7. But one of the very interesting observations I'd make is that, you know, in the Asia Pacific region, we've seen some of the smaller democracies, the smaller city states, have handled COVID best. And there's an interesting geopolitical lesson in here, I think. If you look at countries like Taiwan, countries like New Zealand, they've been doing something very right. And I think it's really important that, as well as the big global commitments to pandemic preparedness and vaccine availability globally, we also look at what the little countries got right in their trust in their government systems, in their population health systems. And it's also true, I think, that maritime economies like the Asia Pacific region, which is absolutely crucial to global growth, biosecurity for them isn't a scientific concept, it's a daily reality of ships coming in, carrying tropical diseases in an archipelago of tiny islands, all growing at 5, 6, 7%. So I think the biosecurity bit is huge. And again, there's a massive opportunity for the UK to be a global exporter of bioscience, biosecurity science. I went to Porton Down a few years ago and suggested that we, rather than sort of slowly wind it down as a Cold War relic of NBC research, we reinvest in it as a campus for biosecurity and link it to the WHO and to the JENA. And I think that's a possibility again. You know, global biosecurity is going to become more and more important, and we're really good at it.
Brilliant. Thank you, George. That's a really interesting throwing us forward. We're coming towards the end of time now. I'm going to come to Tom and then Bex just for some final reflections. Tom, pick up on any of that, but I also wonder if I could ask about these sort of long-term lessons about biosecurity, health, and so on.
Well, sure. I mean, I suppose I will echo what George was saying about us being a superpower. I know I said earlier about us being having this incredible capacity for sequencing, which is, you know, and led by these amazing organisations like UK Biobank and Genomics England, which has been doing the sort of human sequencing as well as the viral sequencing in the Lighthouse labs and things. That's been amazing. And there's also, we've had these, I mean, really led the world, I think it's fair to say, in the RCTs into COVID treatments. And will I be able to remember them? The two treatments that have been found to work, which I will mispronounce at least one of them, but one of them is dexamethasone and the other one begins with T. They've been, so yeah, thank you. They've been shown to work by this amazing huge recovery trial, it's called, which has been a UK-led thing, and it's been astonishing. So I think it really has been, you know, there's been lots that's gone terribly wrong in the UK response to COVID, but the sort of scientific response has been absolutely immense. As for long-term lessons, I mean, I think there's long-term lessons to be learned about. I mean, this is maybe my own personal bugbear, but about not needing to wait for perfect data on things, and not needing to be being quicker and faster moving and thinking more about downside risks than being sure, than absolutely perfect evidence. I mean, again, early on in the pandemic, we had all these concerns about whether locking down early would lead to pandemic fatigue and all these things, and so we're very cautious about locking down too early and relying heavily on a flu pandemic sort of plan. And there have been, it is very likely if we'd locked down a week earlier, it would have saved thousands of lives. And I think. And then later on, we made a mistake with masks of saying we've got evidence for this that it works, so we're going to say it doesn't work. And I think one thing we could have said back then was, like, we haven't got brilliant evidence that it works, but we think it could, and the costs are low and the benefits are potentially great, so we can move faster and wait for the evidence to come in later. And I think that would have been on various points down earlier with masks, with various other things. That would be my lesson. Is just think more of it as a cost and benefits cost benefit analysis, rather than as a waiting for perfect RCTs and waiting for the perfect evidence to do everything, because I think that has cost us quite badly at various points.
Brilliant. And Bex, final reflections from you, and I'm greedily going to squeeze one more audience question in, which is from Devon Viralia in London, who asks about the extent of the challenge of vaccine misinformation on social media and whether you're picking that up at a local level.
So I don't get any vaccine misinformation on my social media, which to me is a reflection of what an echo chamber I live in, because I get a lot of it via my patients and from talking to staff at our practice who do get a lot of vaccine misinformation on social media. It's hugely important. And I think something that we have to do is not only work out how we try to stop that happening. That is, I think, a challenge for the tech companies. It's a regulatory challenge. Much has been written about it, not just related to COVID, related to large questions around American democracy, for example. But I think we also have to think, well, what information do we replace the misinformation with? So what information do we need to get to communities to help them be vaccine confident? And more importantly, perhaps even what precise information, who needs to bring that information to communities? Because the answer to that, I don't think, is necessarily their GP or the NHS. It could be a range of people, including trusted faith leaders, other leaders within communities. And actually everybody who has the vaccine becomes an advocate for the vaccine, whether positively or negatively, which is something I always think when I'm vaccinating people. It's so important to give people time to answer their questions, to make sure that they're heard, their questions are answered, because that person will go and they will tell somebody what their vaccine was like, and that may influence somebody else's choice to have the vaccine. So this works at all levels, I think. Yeah, I'll leave it there. I'm aware we're out of time.
No, that's brilliant point to finish on, and we've got another event actually on disinformation around the vaccine in a couple of weeks, so we will pick up those questions there. Thank you very much to the brilliant panel. Thank you to you for questions, and to the Forum Imperial College London for sponsoring this event. If you enjoyed the discussion, we've got another one in 2 weeks' time on science after coronavirus. What lessons should the scientific community broadly be taking from the pandemic? We've got Rupert Lewis from the Royal Society, Beth Thompson from the Wellcome Trust. All the details are on our website, but goodbye for now.